finance at the University of Hannover. She graduated with a PhD from the ETH in Zurich, and I think you are not so long at Hannover. I don't find this in this since 2018.
Since 2018.
Almost 4 years, yeah?
Yeah.
Is this right? Yes. No, more than 4 years in Hannover. And she has published extensively on inflation expectations. So we are very much looking forward to your presentation and to the insights you are presenting to us.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me well? So yes, thanks a lot for the kind introduction, and let me also thank you and all the organizers again for this extremely timely and interesting conference that you put together, and of course for putting me on the program. So yeah, we've heard a lot of very interesting talks about public debt this morning, and also some about the interaction between monetary and fiscal policy. So now I would like to focus a bit more on the inflation aspect of this whole issue, and present you with some evidence on how consumers' inflation expectations might react to this recent increase in inflation, and what kind of communication central banks could use to try and mitigate the spillover from currently high rates to expectations. So this is joint work with my courses, Michael Lamler and Damian Pfeiffer. The usual disclaimer applies because one of the co-authors is at the Federal Reserve Board. So yeah, as you all know, we've gotten used to very low inflation rates, missing the target from below. That was the central challenge for monetary policy since at least the financial crisis of 2008, and in Germany actually also before that. So a lot of the research has centered around this challenge, but now we're in a slightly different situation where many countries experience a surge in inflation that started last year and seems to be ongoing still. And as you also know, there are several factors driving this surge in inflation. We have different strong supply shocks, and it's not clear yet how long these will last and maybe even intensify. But there was also an issue of relatively strong demand after the pandemic. So all of these factors are now driving inflation. And something that central bankers worry about naturally is, first of all, how long is this going to last? But then second, what is the danger that this experience of suddenly high inflation will become entrenched in expectations, making it much more difficult to bring down inflation overall. So that's something that we want to study in this project. So we want to test which type of communication on inflation going forward, so future expected inflation, may be suitable to at least mitigate a potential spillover from high rates to expectations. So we focus here on households, and yeah, as maybe some of you know, I've been doing that for some time. When we started looking at households' inflation expectations, this was something very rare and exotic, and people kept asking me, why do you ask normal people? That seems kind of strange. Why don't you ask experts? But that has changed, luckily. So by now, central banks are also very interested in consumer expectations. We know that these play a role for decisions taken by consumers, and therefore also for actual inflation. So we run our survey experiment on a representative sample of German households in September of last year. This is part of a larger Bundesbank survey that has been running monthly since 2020 and with a pilot phase in 2019. So we're very happy to be part of this. We were also lucky to be able to include our experiment in the phase where inflation had already accelerated in Germany, but and of course there was public discussion about this, but it wasn't as obvious and as widespread as it is now. And that's also something that we want to use in this experiment. So we studied 2 research questions. The first is, how do consumers' short and long-run inflation expectations react to information about this inflation surge? And then given that expectations are revised, and our hypothesis would be that they are revised upwards and not downwards, after observing this increase, what can we give them in terms of additional information to try and mitigate that effect? So it's kind of a 2-step procedure that we use. And just to remind you, I didn't bring a graph of inflation, unfortunately, but just a short reminder. In September, when we ran the survey, the last observed value of inflation for August was 3.9%, and that's also the value that we use in our treatment. And at that time, maybe you've also forgotten, because we tend to have short memory on these issues, but the dominant discussion at that time was whether this increase would be persistent or temporary. Persistent or temporary in the sense that many people believed that there were kind of one-off factors from the pandemic pushing inflation upwards in that year that would then subside in the next year, so 2022. While there were also others that warned that it might take a little bit longer, but I think nobody expected the effects from the war in Ukraine that we are seeing now. So we are in a completely different discussion now than we were back then. Okay, so yeah, I'll keep this relatively brief. There are quite a few studies already evaluating, also often using survey experiments or natural experiments, how central bank communication can have an impact on consumers' inflation expectations. And also some of them test what happens if you just inform people about current inflation. Generally, we find that this has a strong effect on expectations. Kind of serves as an anchor. But our study is slightly different in the sense that we are in a different situation now. So the previous studies were all conducted in a low inflation environment, where the typical observation we had in Germany, but also in other countries like the US, was that households tend to overestimate inflation. And there are numerous reasons for why this is the case, one of them being that people often observe prices of frequently bought goods, like food or gas prices. And these tend to have higher inflation rates than the overall consumption basket. So if you only observe those prices and you forget about the falling prices in computers, let's say, then this leads to an upwards bias in your expectations. But anyway, that's a general finding. And then if you inform people that actual inflation is actually lower than what they were thinking about future expectations, they typically revise this downwards. And yeah, we want to see if this still holds in our setup when inflation has increased now. And then we also have a number of studies giving people other information from official central bank statements, for instance, or from the media. And typically, the results say that, yes, there is some effect on expectations if we force respondents in the survey to read these statements, but it's relatively small and short-lived. So it's really hard for central banks to get the attention of a typical consumer, even if you have that consumer sitting in your survey and forcing that person to read this statement. So that's the usual conclusion, and what we want to check is, well, now we're in a different situation. Now inflation might actually become an important topic also for households, and that's even more true in this year. So we might expect that attention could also be different, so maybe people react more to any information that we give them. All right. So like I said, the study is part of the Bundesbank Online Panel of Household. This is representative of the German population. And we were able to add our questions to the September 2021 wave. This is a relatively large wave, roughly 3,700 participants. We have 5 treatment arms that are 650 people each. And then we also, we use a bunch of socio-demographic control variables from the main survey. And we use the fact that the core questionnaire already elicits consumers' macroeconomic expectations, including inflation expectations. And so we use these as our prior expectations. So that's our structure. We first, or not we, but the Survey Institute elicits prior expectations for short and long run inflation expectations. There are several different versions of that question in the core questionnaire. We use just the simple point forecasts here. And then we randomly select all the participants into 5 groups. And these are our treatment groups. So the treatment group, which we call basic treatment, that's our control group. In this group, we just inform people about the recent change in inflation, just to make sure that everybody in our sample is aware that inflation in August 2021 was higher than in the year before. And then in the other treatments, we add information to this basic treatment to test whether, if on top of this alerting people to the increase in expectations, additional information can be helpful to then mitigate any increase that we might observe in this basic treatment. So we compare all our effects to this basic treatment. The second one I'll show you in a minute. We call this long-lasting. We have a temporary treatment. We have an SPF treatment. And we also include a placebo treatment where we add some text that's completely unrelated to future inflation, just to make sure that just simply giving people more to read doesn't have a biasing effect on how they react. And then we elicit posterior expectations, and we do this a little differently to other studies in the sense that we don't just ask this question again or a similar question, but we make it very transparent. We ask people if, after having read this information that we gave them, do they want to change their forecast? We actually remind them of their prior forecast to make sure that any change is not due to inaccurate recall. And then they have the option of saying, no, I don't want to change, or I do want to change, and then we ask for the new forecast. So, this is the point forecast question for the prior expectation. It's about 12 months for the short run and either 5 or 10 years. For the long run, so that's the structure of this Bundesbank survey. They always randomly select people for long run expectations and either ask them about the next 5 years or the next 10 years, and we then make sure that our posterior expectations have the same horizon. Okay, so that's the basic treatment. We now show you some information on the inflation rate. The inflation rate in Germany was measured by the Federal Statistical Office at 3.9% in August 2021. 1 year ago, in August 2020, the inflation rate was 0%. So this makes it very obvious that inflation now is higher than it used to be. And then we add the long-lasting treatment. Remember, that was this discussion at the time, is it temporary or long-lasting? So we took a quote from Volker Wieland, who is not here anymore, unfortunately, but was here yesterday. And he gave an interview in March of that year saying that he also expects inflation to increase to an average annual level of 2%. It may even reach 3%. So he was already also underestimating at that point how high it would go. But then he said he also anticipated that in the following years we would see similar rates of inflation at 2 to 3%. And actually there was some discussion on Twitter about this a while ago where people were saying, look, you already said it last year, and he got some praise for that. So that was our long-lasting treatment, and what we wanted to test, of course, was do people get more worried, or maybe there's a higher spillover. That was our prior expectations when we tell them it could be higher for a longer time. And then we had the temporary treatment. That was an indirect quote from Christine Lagarde, who was very prominent in saying this is just happening in that year. So she's made it clear that she sees this year's high inflation rate as a temporary phenomenon. In her view, this is down to one-off factors arising from the pandemic, which are now also apparent in the May figures. So one thing that you should already note is that this is a purely textual statement, so there are no numbers in here, whereas in here there are some numbers, annual level of 2%, and then here annual rates of between 2 and 3%, so just keep that in mind. Right, and then we thought, okay, so those are the two opposing views that we had at the time, but of course we also have just very objective information about experts' expectations, so let's use these as well. So that's our SPF statement, where we just informed people that according to a survey by the ECB among experts, these increased their inflation expectations for the euro area as a whole, including Germany, from 1.9% to their previous forecast of 1.6%. And they also adjusted their longer run expectations to 1.5% and 1.8%. And then finally, we have the placebo test, where we just talk about predicted population growth. And we just gave the numbers here about what the Federal Statistical Office thinks about that. So that shouldn't, I mean, it's actually really hard to find a placebo treatment when you talk about inflation. So almost everything is somehow related or can be related to inflation. But here we thought that that was the best idea we had, at least. It shouldn't be super related, at least. Anyway, and then as I said before, that's our measure of posterior expectations. And we elicited that for short-run and long-run expectations. So we asked, on the basis of this information, would you like to adjust your inflation expectations for the next 12 months? If so, how would you adjust your expectations? And you can either pick no, you could also pick don't know or no answer. Or you could say yes from, and then here people saw their prior forecast, percent to, and then here you put your new forecast. So obviously, I mean, this is, like I said, this is very transparent. We don't expect to measure any change in expectations that is random or coincidental. So in that sense, the changes that we measure are probably kind of a lower bound if you would compare that to other elicitation methods. And it's also obvious that this answer option is more effort than just picking answer no. So if you just pick no, you just continue in the survey. And then we do the same for long run. Okay, so I don't want to spend much time on this very preliminary, no, it's not preliminary, but it's kind of brief table. The only thing I want to point out is the average share of revisions here, which is relatively low. So just 25% of people adjusted their forecast after the information that we gave them. And this is not a lot, but I think it points towards what I just said, that it takes effort to change your forecast, and you had a very easy option not to do it. Okay, so let's have a look at the distributions. These are the changes in short-run inflation expectations. So given that people adjusted their forecast, what is the distribution of the calculated change between prior and posterior expectations for the different treatment groups? So the kind of dashed dotted line is the basic treatment. That's the one you see here. And we see that the mean of this is positive. So on average, people increased their short-run expectations after being informed about recently high inflation. And that's the opposite finding of what other studies in a low inflation regime found, where we had a downwards adjustment after informing people about low inflation, and it's intuitively, it makes sense. But it's good to see that kind of the same logic of the mechanism still applies, but now it goes in another direction. So there is a danger that people that observe high inflation also increase their expectations, even though you saw perhaps the mean of the expectations in the previous table was higher than 3.9 at that time. The placebo looks very, very similar in terms of its shape of the distribution, which is also reassuring. And we also ran tests on statistical equivalence of the distributions, and all of the distributions are statistically different from the basic treatment except for the placebo one. So this is statistically the same. Now if we look at the other treatments, temporary and SPF and lasting or long-lasting, we see that they tend to shift mass more to the left. So the increase in expectations gets reduced. And for the SPF treatment, we see that the mean is actually now here in this negative region. So they tend to lower their expectations after getting this whole text about first current rates and then SPF forecasts. And the same is true for long-run expectations. The graphs actually look pretty similar. Again, the distributions are all statistically different from the basic treatment except for the placebo. And we see that also long-run expectations in the basic treatment increase on average. And this is less pronounced if we give them additional forward-looking information. And mostly in the SPF treatment, we see a reduction also in long-run expectations. So let's have a look at this econometrically. So here we estimate on the full sample the overall treatment effect on posterior expectations. So this is everybody. People that chose no as an answer just had the same forecast as before, so then we put the same number. And then, of course, we have a few people who didn't answer either for prior or posterior expectations. I should point out that we don't look at the full distribution of expectations. So when you look at households' inflation expectations, usually you have a few very extreme estimates that point towards some kind of illiteracy regarding inflation, and typically researchers take these out, and that's also that's something that we do here. So we only look at the range between -5 to +25. Okay, so first of all, we see that posterior expectations are strongly correlated with prior expectation. That makes sense because only 25% adjusted their expectations. The others have the same number here. So obviously you would expect a very strong correlation. But then the question is, what about the treatments? So here in the first column we have no controls, then we add demographic controls, same here. That doesn't really change anything, which is good because the treatments were randomly selected, so there shouldn't be any large effect from those controls. And then we see that on average, that's the constant here, there is an increase by just in the basic treatment in both short and long run expectations, which is more pronounced for short run expectations. But then adding additional information can reduce this, where we see by far the strongest effect from the SPF treatment. And that's what you also saw in the distributions, which shifted to the left in the SPF treatment. So then this initial increase is mitigated, and that's what we see here. For long run expectations, we also see some effect from the other treatments. And interestingly, there isn't a big difference between this long-lasting and this temporary treatment. So what we initially anticipated, that this was the kind of the main discussion at that time, and that this would have a big effect. That's not what our results are saying here.
It's also not significant difference between both effects.
Between those two?
Yeah.
No. Okay. So now that was kind of the overall effect, and then we wanted to split this up into what we call an extensive and an intensive margin, where the extensive margin is, okay, given that we add this additional information, how likely are you to adjust your expectations? And then second, given that you updated your expectations, how strongly is the or how different is the update in those different treatment groups? So this is now the probability of an update in those treatment groups relative to the basic treatment. And here we see that those long-lasting and temporary treatments, both, they do have an effect on the likelihood of adjusting. So in that sense, perhaps, again, not much difference between them, but overall, these more textual statements, if you want to interpret this in a kind of, an optimistic way maybe, you could say that this anchors expectations because it makes people less likely to change their forecast relative to those that are only informed about recently high inflation. So you kind of, you tell them, okay, inflation is high, but going forward, we either think this is temporary only this year, or we think it's temporary in the sense that it might be lasting for some time, but then the numbers that were in the Wieland statement were lower than actual inflation in August 21. So in that sense, there was also some kind of calming effect, let's say, and we see here a lower probability of an update. But now what about those 25% that did choose to update their expectations? Here we don't truncate the data, and instead we estimate Huber robust regressions. And we find now that all of the treatments except for the placebo do have a significant effect on these updates relative to those updates in the basic group, in the sense that these updates here are all lower. So people that update after being given this additional information, they change their expectations upwards by less than those in the basic treatment. And the effects are pretty large, especially for the SPF treatment, where people actually reduce their expectations by 1.5 or 1.2 percentage points relative to the changes in the basic treatment group. So this seems to be a very strong treatment in the sense that it makes a big difference compared to the basic treatment, and also it has the strongest effect on mitigating the spillover from inflation to expectations. But also the other more textual statements are working, and again, relatively similar. We argue that for the SPF, it makes sense to compare this more directly to the temporary statement because, first of all, both are kind of related to the ECB. The SPF is, of course, not the ECB, but we said in the statement that it was conducted by the ECB, so maybe many people interpreted this as actually being ECB forecasts. there we could, and then it's also easier to compare because this doesn't contain any numbers. So then we could say, okay, this seems to be coming from a kind of a similar institution, but giving those numbers, which were considerably lower than actual rates at that time, this had a very calming effect on expectations. So they were reduced downwards by more. Whereas the Wieland statement was more pessimistic, but then also had numbers in it that were lower than actual inflation in August 21. And so apparently people picked up more on that than on the warning that he was trying to give. Okay, so let me conclude. We study the effect of information about the inflation surge on inflation expectations, and want to see how this additional information that is forward-looking can help to mitigate a spillover. And first of all, it's still relatively hard to get the attention or the effort needed to update expectations, even in such a stylized survey setup, and in a situation where this might be of more interest to consumers. It would be nice to do this again now. Maybe that number might have increased. I don't know. But given that this is what we have, we find that still, first of all, informing people about currently high inflation leads to an upwards movement in expectations, which is both for short and for long run. But then forward-looking information can reduce that. And here in particular, the SBF treatment with quantitative estimates, so numerical information about future inflation that is lower than the current rate, seems to be working well. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for staying perfectly in time. First of all, I was happy to realize that Volker Wieland had a significant impact on inflation expectations. But then I was somewhat disappointed that this is less than Christine Lagarde's influence. So, yeah, well, but this is not really serious. The first discussant of this paper is Dimitris Christelis. Dimitris is at the Adams Business School at the University of Glasgow, professor there. He holds a degree from the University of Pennsylvania. Passed some time as a senior economist at the European Central Bank, and then first taught at Naples University, and I don't know, I think since 2013 you are professor of economics at Glasgow.
No, since 2019. And
only 19,
yes,
so
yes.
Just recently, only 3 years ago, so I have this wrongly in your...
An associate professor.
Yeah, well, professor is professor. Okay, floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. So, let me first thank the organizers for inviting me to this wonderful conference and to discuss this paper that I enjoyed reading very much. So thank you, Lena, and your authors. I'll just briefly summarize what's going on. So authors start from a Bundesbank household survey that is representative of the German population. And essentially, they do a randomized control trial with 3 different announcements plus placebo to see whether announcements by policymakers or experts can affect household inflation expectations. Importantly, and I'll come back to that, before applying the different treatments, they inform everybody in the sample about the latest inflation data, namely that in August 21, inflation was 3.9% compared to 0 the previous year. So, what are the announcements? Well, Lena discussed them. So, one is by Volker about making my emphasis on long-term developments. The second is textual announcement by Christine Lagarde. And the third one is estimates, predictions by experts. And I think that is a key word to interpret the result, the use of word experts, surveyed by the ECB. So there is a little bit of ECB thrown in there, but the subjects doing the predictions are experts. The results, well, the experts' forecast has to have by far the strongest effect on inflation expectations, with about 0.5% decrease both in the short and the long run. There is a weaker effect from the Volker and the German Council of Economic Experts, about minus 0.37% for long run inflation expectations. There is an effect for the ECB spread and evaluation, but it's quite small and of marginal statistical significance. And about 75% of the households do not change their inflation expectations after they are treated. So, this is a kind of paper that makes my life as an empirical economist very easy, because I worry about causality a lot, and here you don't need to worry about causality, because it's by design a randomized control trial, so that solves the problem of causality. Now, it not only solves the problem of causality generally, but it solves this even if you want to slice the sample in any way you want, based on predetermined characteristics. So suppose you want to look at the effects, let's say, for the subsample of those who had high inflation expectations prior to the treatment. You can do that because this treatment had no relation with prior inflation expectations. Suppose you want to slice your sample by education. You can do that because your treatment assignment had nothing to do with education. So that's one of the great things about randomization, where typically slicing the sample creates all sorts of causality problems. Using RCTs allows you to slice the sample every way you want, based on predetermined characteristics. And I emphasize that because I'll go later, back to that later. So, initial sample, representative German population, that's great. Okay, we want to work with representative samples, not samples from online brokerages or whatever that exists in the literature. You find the literature so often. We want something that's representative of the German population. However, the next step is an informational intervention. So the authors tell everybody in the sample that what is the true inflation rate. So now the sample is transformed. It's transformed from a representative of the population to what? A counterfactual sample, which is what would be the sample if everybody knew exactly what inflation is. That sample doesn't exist in real life, right? Because there are a lot of people who do not know exactly what is the real rate of inflation. It's also not representative of those who know the real rate of inflation, because those who know the real rate of inflation have a different distribution of characteristics than the Bundesbank sample, right? The Bundesbank sample has a distribution of characteristics for the whole population. Those who know its inflation exactly are likely to have a different distribution of characteristics than the general population. Okay, so we have to think. We start with the representative sample, but then by changing the information set, what are we doing to this sample? So, what we are doing to this sample is, as I said, we are creating a counterfactual sample, and we're examining this counterfactual sample, what happens if these several announcements are made. Okay, that's a well-defined exercise, perfectly plausible results and clean in terms of causality, but that's what it is. These are results on a counterfactual sample. Now, the authors say, okay, why do they inform everybody about the inflation? they say, as we intend to analyze whether information about inflation projections affects the transmission of current inflation dynamics and expectations, we deem it important to inform all respondents about current inflation. So that's the justification for telling everybody what the real inflation is. But, okay, that's, I mean, it's a laudable objective, but note that current inflation dynamics are the results of billions of economic decisions that are made also by people who do not know what inflation is. Okay? What you observe in the actual data is a lot of people making decisions, and many of these people, and I include professional economists among them, do not have a good idea of how the economy works. It's a very complex system. It's very informationally demanding. So we make mistakes, and we make mistakes that are not random, but are systematic. And all these actions of many people who make systematic mistakes are reflected in this current inflation dynamics. So let's look also at from the point of view of policymakers. So suppose I'm a policymaker, and I want to influence inflation expectation. Whose inflation expectations do I want to influence? I want to influence inflation expectations of the actual population, primarily. I think that's more important than influencing the expectations of a subsample who knows inflation exactly, or of a counterfactual subsample of all the population who knows inflation exactly. What policymakers want to influence is the inflation expectations of the actual population, with all the mistakes, the problems, the misperceptions, the prejudices that the actual population has. So, connected to that, we applied economists very often look at averages, and the regression essentially represent average effects. And from policymakers' point of view, it might be more sensible not to look at averages, but let's say at subsamples. So I would assume that the ECB would care more to influence the expectations of those who have unreasonably high inflation expectations. So if someone has inflation expectations from 0 to 2%, maybe the ECB does not care about that person very much. The ECB says that this person is okay. What the ECB cares about is to bring down the expectations of those who have inflation expectations of 10, 15, 20%. That's where the ECB needs to focus. And that is not going to reflect it in averages. But because the treatment is randomized, the authors can very easily do that. They can limit their estimation to those that have very high inflation expectations and see what are the effects for this subsample that the ECB or other policymakers care about. And it could be interesting to see if there are any differences. That's based on the prior inflation expectations. One can also look at the posterior, that is posterior to the treatment inflation expectations, using quantile regression, and see whether these effects are particularly important for those that have high inflation expectations post-experiment. Because again, that's what the policymakers want to hit on. Okay, bring down those expectations of those people who are very pessimistic. I suppose, for symmetry's sake, they could also look at those who have negative inflation expectations, but I would expect that there are very few of those these days, or fewer than they used to be anyway. So, in terms of the results, well, why are the ECB results weak? Could it be because the announcement is not numerical? That's a possibility. Could it be because some of the sample don't like ECB, don't trust ECB? Again, very easy for the authors to look at this subsample using the randomized control trial and see, is the effect stronger for those who trust the ECB versus those who do not? Similarly, for the announcement by Volker on the Council of Economic Experts, maybe some people are not affected by this because they don't know about the Council of Economic Experts. So are the results different for those who do know about the Council and for those who do not? Again, very easy to check. The stronger results for the professional forecasters. Could it be that because they are described as experts in the question, and experts are associated with professionalism, in some sense also removed from politics more than the ECBs or more than the Council of German Council of Economic Experts, I suppose, but because the government work is there, maybe this sample is associated with the government, while experts, technocrats are not. So maybe that's one reason why the results for those experts, the survey professional forecasters, are stronger. Something about the questions. The questions, the authors do ask them in a very standard way, which is, what is your expected inflation, whatever, next year or the next 5 or 10 years. There's one problem with this kind of question, which is you don't really know whether the answer represents a mean, a mode, or a median. Okay, it could be that it's a mode, so that's the value with the highest probability, but that's not necessarily the mean. If you ask questions in the way Charles Mansky advocates, which is use beans of values and then people assigning probabilities in each bean, then you can get an expectation that way, and also crucially get measures of uncertainty, because you can calculate the moments of the distribution, and it would be very interesting to see how these announcements also affect uncertainty, not just the means. Now, the authors have a point when they say that beans have a problem as well, and Lena was telling me that she has had some bad experiences with surveys she has done with people putting 100% on a single bean just to get on with the survey. So this point is well taken. But they have worked in other surveys, including the New York Fed and the ECB survey. Now, I'm a bit wary about the way they ask questions to confirm whether people have changed. Because some people might be resistant to admitting that there is a reason to change. They don't need to do that, because their outcome is, in their main regression, is not the change, it's the level. So they could just ask the level of inflation expectations, and that would work. Maybe they would randomize even that. In some sample, not ask for this confirmation. In actuality, people are bombarded with news, right? So a different treatment could also be to get more than one announcement together, to see the cumulative effect. Because people, when they listen to the news, they hear from many sources. I have a problem with the extensive margin calculations, because these are on a subsample that is not random. It is determined by the treatment, because it's those who change our expectations. So treatment ceases to be exogenous. It's not a predetermined characteristic. And they should also check, I think, maybe through multinomial logic, whether randomization is actually done correctly. Anyway, so I'll finish. This is a very well-defined exercise. It makes sense. It produces sensible result, and on a very topical issue. The results make sense, and they are moderately optimistic about the ability of policymakers to influence household inflation expectations. What I have said is probably material for many papers, which I offer them in the spirit of showing the possibilities that a great survey like that offers in terms of doing analysis.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Second discussant of the paper is Mirko Wiederholt. Mirko is currently professor of economics at Munich University. He first studied at Humboldt University Berlin, finishing with a master's degree. Then he went to the European University Institute in Florence, like Gernot, and finished his PhD there. He held positions, well, first of all as assistant professor at Humboldt University and Northwestern University, then full professor at the University of Frankfurt until 2018, and he moved to Sciences Po in Paris, where he's currently on leave, so he has not fully left for Munich, so I'm looking forward to, at least according to the city. So I'm looking forward to learn more about this later on in the coffee break. Maybe you can tell me about this. So we are looking forward to your comments. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks a lot for the organizers to ask me to discuss this paper. I very much enjoyed the conference and very much enjoyed reading the paper. Let me give you a quick summary. I guess by now it should be clear. So the question is how to limit the spillover from inflation to inflation expectations. Method is an information provision experiment. This is starting to be used more in macro, and it's interesting because this is actually an opportunity to do randomized controlled trials in macro, which normally we can't do. The basic structure is very simple. You elicit people's initial beliefs, you treat them with some information, and then you elicit people's posterior beliefs after they've been treated with that information. This was done in the Bundesbank online panel on households. Prior is you elicit people's inflation expectations, their short and long run inflation expectations, and then there are these different treatment groups. Treatment 1 is basically people are informed about recent inflation and inflation the year before. Then there's this placebo treatment where basically non-relevant information is added to that, and then there are these 3 other treatments where relevant information is added to that. And the way I interpret it is the idea that we would always like to inform people about the current inflation rate and the past inflation rate. And the question is just, would we also like to inform them about some additional things, forecasts about the future, to kind of mute the effect of telling them what current inflation is. Well, we would always like people to be informed, but maybe this raises inflation expectations, so would we maybe like to tell them something else to mute the effect of treating people with what has happened on inflation expectations. And then there are 3 different treatments in that regard. So there's this Volker Wieland statement, there's the ECB president statement, and then there's some forecast by experts. Let me not talk about the results in details. I think they're clear by now. But I think the answer to the initial question is, how can you kind of mute the spillover? Well, provided for people, in addition to the current inflation rate, tell people a forecast that's somehow not that high for the future, and then people's inflation expectations are not going to move up that much. What's nice is it works, and it's not only we kind of guess it works, but we have a randomized controlled trial that it works. And in principle, if you're a policymaker, these are amazing tools, because suppose you want to do some communication the day before, you can do a randomized controlled trial. You can try the communication, you have the effect, the next day you go out, you do the communication. Here it's complicated because you have to ask the Bundesbank 12 months in advance, I guess, to do that. So I'm currently doing this in the US, where we do it with our own service, and we can run it the next day, and basically a policymaker comes to us, says, I would like to communicate this. We run it in the US, and a couple of hours later we have the causal effect of that communication onto the beliefs of people. And so if you don't do it with the Bundesbank, but if you do it with your own survey, you immediately get this causal effect. You can do that on a daily basis. So that just to show you some potential of this methodology, Lena, has used this methodology before, and I think it's a very powerful methodology. So just background. So I think we know from earlier information provision experiments that this works. So if you elicit people's prior beliefs and then you tell them an inflation forecast or number that's lower, people are going to revise in the direction of that. So I think we knew that before. So what's specific to this environment? Well, I think the 2 kind of details, you asked about the short and long run. The way they're asked, they're first asked, do you really want to change your forecast? But then I think the key is here in these different treatments, it's always you inform them about the current inflation rate and you add some information about the future, and then there are different ways how this information about the future is phrased. I think that's the key innovation. And then what's very clear is that adding this information about the future has an effect. It's very clear, and it can be interpreted in a causal way. What's I think more subtle is we also see these differences between these three different treatments, and we know, the effects are different. We've estimated the causal effect. What's more difficult to say is why are these differences between treatment 2, 3, and 4. And I think here, the language needs to be kind of worked on a little bit, because these treatments, they differ in multiple dimensions. So who's speaking? The ECB president Volker Wieland, this is a survey. Do we say inflation is permanent increase or transitory, or there's no statement about that? What's the precise number that people are confronted as? There are just 3 dimensions. So if I now go back and I can say, oh, it's because Volker Wieland talked about things being permanent, well, it could also be just that people are confronted with a lower number. So I think there we can just not say what is the reason why these outcomes are different for these 3 different treatments. My preferred interpretation of the result, when individuals are given an additional number, they update in the direction of that number. The lower the number, the more they update. And I think Christine Lagarde has this implicit number. She said it's going to be lower, but you've just been told that it's been 3.9%. So, the statement is basically saying it's going to be below 3.9%. And then, this is the weakest effect, this is the second weakest effect, this is the strongest effect. So if you just rank these numbers, I think it's perfectly consistent with this idea. Now, so I think this is great, and so now let me talk about policy implications. So I went fast here because I want to spend some time talking about what I think the policy implications are. So what have they established? Well, the question is how to limit the spillover from inflation to inflation expectations. Answer, and I buy that number, that answer that they're giving, provide people with a low quantitative inflation forecast. Then, tell people it's 8%, but next year it's going to be 2%, or 3%. That's going to work, and they show, with randomized control trial that works. Now, I think the key question is, and sorry, I went yesterday, I watched mine with Lena, and actually before going to bed, and then actually 2 people said we should do that. They said, oh, we have this risk of a wage price spiral. What should we do? We should somehow get lower wages, for example, by getting lower inflation expectations, and then we'll get less of the wage price spiral. They just have to open this paper to understand how can you get these lower inflation expectations while they're treating people. So kind of we have it all here, and the question is just, do we want to use it? So does the monetary and the fiscal authority actually want to do that? Do they want to treat people in this way, tell people inflation will be low, thereby move downward the inflation expectations, and thereby get lower wage increases and get less of a wage price spiral? And you immediately feel like the answer should be yes, and I really think the answer is no. I don't think we want to do that. And this goes beyond their paper. You don't make any statement about whether we should actually do that or not. But I want to explain briefly why I think we should not do that. Concern number 1 is, of course, the reputation of the monetary and fiscal authority. I don't think Christine Lagarde wants to go out there and say again that this is transitory or low, that they should expect it alone. I don't think Volker Wieland wants to go out there again and tell people inflation next year will be 2 to 3%. I think, currently I think the reputation of these institutions is at stake. So I think if anything, you want to give people what you really think is your forecast for next year, and that might even be a forecast that is actually on the upper end of what people are thinking. So that's number 1. But I think the even more important concern is that this would work in think about the wage price spiral. You bring down inflation expectations, you bring down wages by bringing down inflation expectations, and thereby you mute inflation. But we not only have an inflation problem, we have a purchasing power crisis. And here I'm using the language from the Financial Times. And if you do that, you actually make the purchasing power crisis worse, because the idea of avoiding a wage price spiral is to prevent wage increases. But if you prevent wage increases and you have inflation, you're actually reducing real wages. So you're making the purchasing power crisis worse. Which then probably policymakers would be asked to address through some transfer to households. And then you would have a policy mix where you treat people's inflation expectations down, so you have lower nominal wages. That actually reduces real wages, and then you augment that with some transfers to actually bring their income back up. So you would have a policy mix of an information treatment and a transfer. And to me, that sounds like a very bad policy mix. And I want to make this very precise here with a little bit of equations. why you would actually bring real wages down. And I want to make an alternative suggestion. So my suggestion would be an alternative information treatment using the same methodology, but it is telling people price dispersion has gone up. Now is the time for bargain hunters. Go out there and compare relative prices. Huh? So what would be the effect of that? Take a model, monopolistic competition, see as demand function. You have this structure here. This is the price elasticity of demand, but price elasticity of demand depends on attention to relative prices. So we showed that in a paper in the Review of Economic Studies 2015. So price elasticity of demand depends on attention to relative prices. Then take a standard Kopernikus production function, labor input, think of this as being gas or intermediate inputs, firm's price as a markup over marginal cost. Here is the marginal cost depends on wage, depends on the price of gas. So now suppose through some mechanism you bring wages down. This could be the round table, this could be the information treatment. If you bring wages down by, let's say, 10% or say 1%, you bring prices down by 0.5%. Because the power here is 1/2. Labor is not the only factor of production. So this means if you bring wages down by 1%, you bring prices down by 0.5%. That means you bring real wages down. But that means you do the treatment, you bring inflation down, but actually you bring real wages down, so you make the purchasing power crisis even worse. So that's why I think I would not operate on this term here, but instead I would operate on this term here. So if you manage to tell people go out and shop, compare prices, therefore price elasticity of demand is going up, that means that markups are going down, because people become more price sensitive. And if markups are going down, you have lower price increases, less inflation, but you also have higher real wages. So you solve both problems at the same time. And I know this sounds unconventional, but I think in unconventional times we need unconventional policies. I think we would like to solve these problems at the same time. So just to conclude, I think it's a great paper by Lena and Dräger. I think scientifically I have very little to complain about this, just that it's difficult to interpret where the differences are coming from between these treatments. But I would prefer a different policy. I would do the treatment, not forecast for inflation is low, but I would do the treatment, go out there and shop. There's a lot of price dispersion out there. You can make good bargains right now. That should encourage people to compare prices, increases price elasticity of demand, reduces markups, mutes inflation, increases real wages, so solves these two problems at the same time. Alternatively, if this is too unconventional, I think one could follow Lena Dräger's approach of providing individuals with a low quantitative inflation forecast. The advantage would be that she has already shown through the information treatment that this works, and so that would be also a very good.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, come on. Yeah.
Two short comments and one question. The first comment is that it isn't surprising that professional forecasters are especially influenced by this information. My conclusion is this cannot be professionals because this additional information which was given should be familiar to them, should not be news to them. So this survey was introduced by initiative. I hope that these are professional in other fields, but on inflation, I am afraid the result is showing they are not. My second observation is the following. People don't believe in official statistics on inflation. When in 2002 the Euro notes and coins were introduced, at the ECB, we had to realize that the term total was introduced. The highest inflation, so to say, since now. De facto, Germany was, in IMF term, close to deflation risk. So a huge gap between perceived inflation and actual inflation. So in case in your survey people were asked about, informed about present inflation and future inflation. If people don't believe in a majority in the published numbers, which are correct as we know, but the perception of inflation is different from what is measured, especially in times when first items daily buy are increasing, which is typically in such a situation, coming out of very low inflation, then people perceive much higher inflation than current numbers show. And my question is it's more speculation. After this experience of trying to influence inflation expectations, remember at the end of June of last year, the ECB still explained in 2 years' time we will be confronted with the problem of too low inflation again. How credible is a central bank telling people this inflation will be transitory, at least not so bad, against the background of this experience? So if you would repeat, the study, I would expect that the result would be even worse. Question, it's speculation.
I think I can take up one more question.
Yeah, I have 2 comments and, well, 2 tiny questions. So thanks, Lena, for this presentation. So the first one, adds a bit up to Mirko's different dimensions. So I also saw that there's different dimensions. Also, like, there might be noise or like confusion because of the timing of the statements. Because it was March and May, I think, so rather old, and this might confuse people when they see it in September and think, okay, this is old information. Why should I revise my forecast for this old information, outdated information? That was one problem I had. Also, I thought about like maybe people are also confused of the year definition, so year inflation for 2021, but they had to forecast September 2022 inflation, so there might be confusion from that. And then the second comment is about like the SPF result, and I just thought, doesn't it mean, so if the professionals' forecast is actually like influencing consumers' expectations, doesn't it mean that the central bank doesn't have to target consumer expectations anymore, but we have to target expert expectations because they are actually more effective than the central bank communication to the public? Just an extreme thought. And well, let me introduce it to one tiny question. So do they know the target rate? I didn't get it. Maybe you said it. Whether they know about the target rate? Maybe it could be like another treatment that they just learn something in general, like the target rate and what the central bank does as an alternative treatment. Okay, thank you.
Final question.
Just 2 very short questions. The first question is, does konzertierte Aktion or konzertierte Aktion, or kind of konzertierte Aktion reduce inflation expectations when employer associations, trade associations, and government will sit together and say, well, we will not dramatically increase wages, we will not dramatically increase prices, the government will support both? That's the first question. And the second one is gain hunting. I think you see consumers are completely informed at the moment, or not completely, but more informed than any time before. They can look into the internet. So if you say gain hunting, you will get problems because they already look at the computer, they look for the cheapest petrol price. There will be no big effect, I think.
Okay, so thanks a lot for all those great comments, in particular, of course, to my 2 discussants. I think I'm just going to pick out a few points. Dimitris, Dräger. Thanks for those comments, very well taken. So I think I disagree a little bit on what you were saying about this intensive margin, but we discussed that last night. Many very good suggestions about additional checks that we can do, and we will definitely follow up on those. And I like your suggestion about all conditioning on more on where you are in terms of the distribution of prior expectations. I think that's a very good idea. And also the trust in the ECB. The thing is, we don't have complete control over this survey, and it has a core which is always asked, but then they always add more questions. So I will have to go and check what we have in this wave or in the prior or posterior waves. There is a little bit of panel composition in the survey, so some households get interviewed the month before also, or the month after, so I'll check if we find the trust in ECB question somewhere in there. Yeah, and then obviously there's always trade-offs about how you measure these posterior expectations. I completely agree that some people might have difficulties in admitting that an error, so to speak, or a perceived error, and therefore choose not to update. So that could be another factor for why we see a low probability of updates. On the other hand, all the other measures, you include a lot of seemingly updates that are not actual or not conscious updates, but more, I don't know, inaccurate recall or a difference between the type of questions. So that's obviously a trade-off. About experts not being the ECB, I'm not so sure. So what we are arguing in the paper more in the direction that because the ECB is mentioned so explicitly, and we actually had a referee who misunderstood the treatment and thought it was ECB projections, and obviously that could have happened to respondents in the survey as well. So it could be either way, but I think it will be impossible to check. Yes, of course, sorry. And the Mirko also, very good comments, thank you. The thing is, when this paper came out in January this year, and we thought we were super timely, and we were for about a month, and then Ukraine happened. So, of course, the situation now is very different, and we would probably choose different treatments also if we did this now, and obviously I wouldn't advise anybody to keep telling this temporary story now, so I think that ship has sailed. But the other idea is really cool. I don't think you could do it in this survey, but it might be something that you could do, for instance, in the Nielsen panel, where you could then actually observe how people changing their shopping patterns after you treat them like that. Yeah. And the other comments, so the SPF is, the survey is on households, so we just inform them about the SPF forecast. It's not, the experts are not surveyed, so I think that was a misunderstanding perhaps. And the reason that we inform everybody about inflation is precisely that we know there's this large heterogeneity in perceptions of current inflation. In low inflation times it tends to be overestimated, maybe not so much now. But that gives us a way to disentangle those effects, even though I agree then we have a treated sample. Okay, I think I'm going to stop here.
Yeah, I think you can discuss this over the coffee break. We only have 15 minutes left now for the coffee break because we must be right on time at 3:30. Just because the talk by Bill will be filmed and streamed, and therefore as a larger audience, in particular the British press, is listening to each word that you will choose, and therefore we also must be in time. So just take a cup of coffee, drink fast, talk fast, and be back in time.